Kia ora everyone. I'll welcome today to this Aotearoa Circle hui on the agri-sector adaptation scenarios. Thank you for joining. We've got an hour to cover a lot of content, so we'll kick off straight away. I know there's more people going to be joining as we go. So first, to introduce myself, I'm Jenny Cameron, one of the co-chairs of this work, along with Craig Ellison, who was up till very recently the CEO of Ngāi Tahu Holdings Limited, amongst many other roles he holds, but unfortunately he can't be here today. So I will kick off first with a karakia to get us in the right tone for the meeting. Kia tau ngā manaakitanga a te mea ngaro, ki runga ki teina a tātou, kia mahea te hua mā kihikihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, kia tūturu, kia whakamua, kia tina, hui e, taikie. To let the life and strength and life force of our ancestors be with each and every one of us, freeing our path from obstruction so that our words, spiritual power, love and language are upheld, permanently fixed, established and understood forward together. So first of all, I hope you we are in this hui to discuss the scenario work for the agri sector around climate change adaptation. So hopefully you know that you're in the right forum for that. First of all, to acknowledge that this work is extremely important and ever so much more timely given the tragic and recent events with Cyclone Gabrielle, and I know a number of you will still be dealing with those effects. And we know those impacts will still be long-lasting for a while. This has highlighted how our need to put adaptation much further up the to-do list is critical. We've been focusing a lot on mitigations, which of course is still important, but the role that adaptation will need to take and need to be accelerated actions around that. So the work that the Aotearoa Circle has been leading as well as the leadership group, which has had the time and effort from a number of your companies involved in it, and the technical advisory group, has been very well received and very timely. Furthermore, that dealing with climate change and changing weather is something that our farmers, growers, foresters have to do all the time. We deal with changing weather, but what we're seeing is that the impacts of it are increasing, the volatility is increasing, and that the need to continually plan, adjust and readjust is going to heighten as we look, as we see the impacts of climate change accelerating. So what these scenarios do is to try to identify, they're not predictions, they're not forecasts, they're scenarios to enable some of the decision making to be able to be held and to foresee how we can deal and adapt with what may come to be, but also how we can try and prevent some of the worst impacts happening. And we know that those impacts are on humans, are on our animals, are on crops, our ability to harvest, the impacts on the community, whānau and individual resilience, as we've seen with the recent events as well, and that mental resilience as well, and how much it tests our sectors. But that as much as the agricultural sector is at the forefront of the impacts of climate change and with this changing weather, we're also at the forefront of some of the ways that we can adapt and mitigate that as well. And that's why some of this work is so important. So with that introduction, I will just hand over now to PwC, who have been the wheelhouse behind the analysis and the intellect behind this, as well with the leadership group and the technical group. We'll hear from them. We'll have an overview of the scenarios, the key considerations that went into the scenario planning, and then have us some time on how to understand and use the scenarios, because I know that's one of the factors of, so what do we do with this information? And with that, we'll highlight on how there is also a roadmap and an action plan coming off the back of these scenarios too. We'll have time for questions and answers, and then there will also be some more information about how this is being released and also how that fits in with the roadmap release as well. So over to you now, Annabelle. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and good afternoon, everyone. By way of introduction, my name is Annabelle Charters, for those of you who don't know me, and I lead the Sustainability and Climate Change practice at PwC here in New Zealand. I'm joined today by Phoebe McCarthy, who is a very critical member of the team that has helped to deliver this work over the past year. And I'd also like to acknowledge Victoria Hatton, who I think is on this call today, PwC alumni now and the new CEO of Food HQ, who led this piece of work over the past year until very recently as well. It's quite an exciting day today because in hosting this webinar and holding this webinar and going through the climate scenarios, we're marking a body of work that it's taken about a year. I think it was about a year ago that we started this journey. And some of you who are on the call, a lot of the slides we'll go through will be familiar because we've covered them before. For others, it may be new information. What it amounts to, as Jenny has already articulated so clearly, is that this is very important, highly topical, and is I suppose the launch pad for a huge amount of action as the agriculture sector considers the impacts of climate change and thinks about what needs to be done to ensure it's resilient in the years and decades ahead. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so what we will aim to go through in the next while is a bit of background on this project and how it's progressed over the past year or so, a bit of a 101 on climate scenario analysis, an overview specifically of the agriculture sector climate scenarios that we've landed on, and then a bit of a discussion around how those sector level scenarios can be applied at an individual organisational level in New Zealand. And there will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. As we go through, if you do have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat and I can pick them up at the end. So as a starting point, just to refresh those who have been part of this the whole time and for others that are new to it, the foundational idea behind this work was to explore how climate change could affect the agriculture sector and the most appropriate response the sector should take. This work is looking specifically at adaptive capacity and not mitigation, so not reducing emissions. The reason for that being that it was felt, as Jenny said, that there was already a lot of work and focus on mitigating emissions in New Zealand. And there was a need to turn a lens to understanding the realities of climate change, that it's already here and is going to be increasing volatility in our climate. How best should the sector respond to that to ensure its resilience? So as part of this process, we worked through three key elements in this project. The first was to undertake a sector level climate risk assessment that became an input into developing climate scenarios. The second was to investigate and really articulate the challenges that the agriculture sector is going to face in light of climate change. And that included looking at the implications if the sector does nothing, if we continue, I suppose, BAU in the status quo situation. And then thirdly, it was to identify opportunities that could come from understanding the implications of climate change and the volatility that's going to come with that, and the opportunities that come from addressing those challenges as well. The output of this work has been twofold. Firstly, the climate scenarios, which we'll talk about in more detail today. And then secondly, an adaptation roadmap for the sector that looks at a number of key actions the sector as a whole needs to take to progress its adaptation in the most successful way. And I understand that Jack Keys from the Circle will talk a little bit more about the adaptation roadmap at the end of this session in terms of progress with that. It feels a little bit cute to be asking the question why we're doing this piece of work. I think there's probably not an individual on the call who would challenge the fact that we are already facing into disruption from climatic events, and certainly Cyclone Gabriel has brought that home to us very clearly in the last few months. Even before that, though, we've seen really, really heavy rains in the last few years, and the patterns of that rainfall and the impact it's had both on our geography, on our landscapes, but also on our sources of revenue in the agriculture sector in terms of loss to crops, impacts on production across the board. More broadly for New Zealand, the country is expected to warm between 0.7 and 3 degrees by 2090. Now, while 2090 feels a long way off, even small changes in temperature have huge implications on how we respond to them, how our crops respond to them, how animals respond to them, and therefore the implications on our livelihoods. Inevitably, as the weather gets hotter, particularly in the north, there is an increasing risk of pests and biodiversity loss. And of course, with the changes in rainfall patterns, while we see very obviously the heavy rainfall we've had in parts of the country, in other parts of the country that are already susceptible to droughts, we're going to see even more drier conditions in the future. So what's going to happen with long, skinny Aotearoa is that the wet parts are going to get wetter and the dry parts are going to get drier, and there's going to be lots of volatility in between. Any of our low-lying land areas are going to be more susceptible to storms. And of course, while we've talked about crops and animals being impacted by these changes in weather, there is going to be increasing risk of conditions that are going to impact workers, particularly workers who are outside in the future as well. Ultimately, climate change is not going to just impact one part of the agriculture sector value chain. There are implications that are going to be felt across the whole value chain in the future. In terms of the challenges, I've just been through some of those in terms of the disruption in severe weather events. There is a need for a roadmap that sort of charts a course of action ahead. And there's already a lot of focus, as I said before, on mitigating those emissions and not as much on understanding how we adapt to what could be a new future. There's certainly more pressure on the agriculture sector to play its part. We're constantly hearing about the need for the sector to think about its emissions profile in particular, but also to think about what its future might look like, particularly when it is such a huge part of our economy here. And then finally, with the release of mandatory climate disclosure reporting in New Zealand and the development of the reporting standard by the External Reporting Board, there's been a real focus on undertaking sector level risk and scenario analysis, and I'll talk about that in more detail as we go through the pack. But the intention of this work was to support that recommendation as much as possible as well for the sector. Jenny referred to the large number of people that had been involved in this work over the past year, and I just wanted to emphasise and acknowledge firstly our co-chairs, Jenny and Craig, in terms of their leadership in progressing this work and being part of this project right from the outset and enthusiastic supporters of it. We've also been ably supported by a very, very strong leadership group that represents the breadth and depth of the agriculture sector in New Zealand. In addition to the faces that you see on the screen, we've had engagement and consultation with more than 70 individuals across the sector throughout the course of this work. So it certainly hasn't been done in isolation or in a vacuum. There has been rigorous debate and dialogue throughout. It's probably also worth commenting here that in terms of looking at the sector as a whole, we've also, as much as possible, looked at that subsystem level for the sector, recognising that not all parts of the agriculture sector are the same, and there are different risks, opportunities and challenges faced by the different subsystems. This work looked at 5 specific subsystems, those being dairy, sheep and beef, horticulture, forestry and cropping. And so the faces you see on the screen and the large number of other people that have been involved in this project represent those subsystems as well as the sector as a whole. Just very briefly, in terms of the process we've gone through, we've undertaken a climate risk identification process right at the outset to understand at a sector level and subsystem level what are the greatest risks that we need to consider from climate change in the future. We've developed 3 climate scenarios, which we'll talk about, of course, later, and looked at the large-scale driving forces that impact those scenarios as they unfold over decades. We've sought to understand the impact, consequences and challenges of those scenarios playing out across New Zealand. And then in response to, I suppose, the challenges and risks, we've also sought to understand the opportunities that the sector could take advantage of, both in responding to climate change, but also in terms of mitigating and managing risks that the sector might face. And finally, as I mentioned before, there's been the development of an adaptation roadmap, which is also nearing its end. More on that soon. So, what is climate scenario analysis? Now, the concept of scenario analysis is not a new one, and I'm sure many of you on the call have already used it in your strategic decision making, and it's certainly an integral part of the decision making that some organisations use all the time. The climate change element is, of course, bringing that climate overlay to plausible descriptions of how the future might unfold or develop. In terms of what scenario analysis is, it's a tool for critical decision making. So scenario analysis isn't an end in of itself, but it's a really, really useful input into strategic decision making and how you might think about the future of your organisation. It's a process for exploring and considering alternative possible future states and building different narratives and different assumptions over time as those future states unfold. And it's a way of communicating different future states as well. So it's a really useful and accessible communication tool in terms of why things might happen in the future and the decisions you make that underpin those as a result. In terms of how the climate scenarios have informed the adaptation strategy and the adaptation roadmap we've been building out, it has allowed us as a sector group to think about how we might prepare for the future and exploring the limits of what could happen in that future. There is a huge body of data that underpins the scenarios that then again informs and tests the resilience of the sector and helps to challenge those decisions that might be made in the future based on the scenarios and how they unfold. And they help to explore and create flexibility in what a future might look like and that decision-making process, recognizing that when we look at climate change and we look at what is an increasingly volatile world, there has to be flexibility, there has to be consideration that things won't stay the same. But it's very, very hard with so much ambiguity to make decisions over long-term horizons. Just very quickly, when we talk about scenario analysis, it's useful to understand what it does and doesn't include, and this holds true for the scenarios we've developed as part of this project. So they can be organizational specific, or in the case of this work, sector specific, but there has to be a defined scope. The scenarios apply to something, a sector or a scenario, and those boundaries need to be defined. There are many what-if questions. There's not just one that we're asking as part of this work and how we develop the scenarios. That, of course, makes for a fairly complex and complicated body of work in terms of the development of the scenarios, because it's not just one factor that could change in the future. Key input into the scenarios are risks. And when we talk about risks and how they play out across the various scenarios, we have to bear careful consideration for the materiality of those risks. So we're looking at the most significant, most material risks, in this case, that the sector might face. And when we develop the scenarios, as I said, we've developed 3, which is in line with the recommendations of the External Reporting Board for the climate-related disclosures. These are expected to be quite significant in terms of the plausible futures that they represent. These are not just variations on a theme, they are quite different scenarios in each case. The other thing to bear in mind with scenarios is that they are dynamic and evolving. They're not just a point of time consideration. And so in terms of understanding the narratives and applying them in your specific organizational context, it's important to hold them lightly and understand where assumptions may differ or may be a little bit different for one organization from another. In terms of what scenarios are not, and this is very important to recognize, they're not one-size-fits-all approaches. And so with, as I said before, the specific scope of what the scenario is focused on, it's very, very important to understand the limitations of that at the same time as well. So the broader the scope, the more general the narratives are likely to be. And they can't necessarily easily be swapped in and out for a different scope or context. We're certainly not asking a single straightforward what-if question. As I said, these are many and varied. It's not just one thing that changes or one consideration in the future. It's much more complex. Scenario analysis is not an exact prediction of what might happen in the future, and it's certainly, as I said before, there's not slight variations between the scenarios. They are quite specific in their own right and quite varied in terms of the assumptions that underpin them. The scenarios don't include general descriptions because we are looking at a range of different considerations or attributes. They tend to be quite specific in nature in terms of how they look at the implications or the impact on those particular variables in the future. In terms of the benefits of scenario analysis, while there's certainly a requirement, as I keep saying, under the XRB's climate-related disclosures to undertake scenario analysis, the benefits of undertaking this sort of exercise are massive as organisations face into what is an increasingly unpredictable and uncertain future. Scenario analysis allows you to think about risks and opportunities that your business may face. And as part of this work, it's allowed us to think about those risks and opportunities in a broader sector context. In terms of understanding possible future states, that of course allows organisations, and in this case the sector as a whole, to think with a great deal more flexibility, creativity and innovation around what might happen in the future and the opportunities that come with that. And certainly in anticipating the consequences of what might happen in the future, that arms everyone in the sector with more information in terms of the decision-making process and decisions that are made in a short, long and medium term. And finally, you see out there, it's got more accurate risk-based pricing. It also enables more accurate risk-based costing as well. So you get a better sense of where there could be increased costs in the future to your business and how to mitigate the impacts of those, as well as to think about your pricing models. From an opportunities perspective, understanding future possible outcomes of climate change has huge implications for thinking about resource efficiency and how you might do things differently in the future when resources are more constrained. It's going to be useful in informing policy considerations, regulatory considerations, and how you might benefit from thinking about the transition to a zero carbon economy. There's huge opportunity in thinking about products and services and markets and assets that may open up for you as an organisation, for the sector as a whole, on the basis of the changing climatic conditions of New Zealand and indeed the globe as a whole. So let's now move specifically to the scenario analysis that we've done for the agriculture sector. First, I thought it would be useful to look at the top physical and transition risks that were identified by the sector, as these are a key input into developing the climate scenarios themselves. Just to be clear, in terms of those physical risks, we're looking at the risks that arise from changes to the climate or extreme weather events, so acute and chronic physical risks. And then in terms of transition risks, when we talk about transition risks, we're talking about the risks and opportunities that might arise in the process of us adjusting or transitioning to a low carbon economy. A risk is a risk is a risk, so they are all relevant, but it's also useful to think about those two categories of climate risk when you're thinking about the impacts of climate change on your business. In terms of the physical risk, and again, these were sector-wide, appreciate that for some of the subsystems, these may be less or more material than for others. But the 5 that were identified were the inability for existing practices to maintain productivity and output, increased volatility in production and a reduced ability to get product to market, an inability for agriculture industry operators to access financial products, including insurance, an increase in pests and diseases, and an increase in water stress and lack of water security. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list of the physical risks for the sector, but these were the ones that as a group, the leadership group and the technical group agreed on as being the most material for the sector to focus, that the sector is facing into. From a transition risk perspective, there were 6 material risks identified, or key risks identified. The first being the inability for the sector to develop a whole system approach to build resilience for effective adaptation. an inability for the sector to keep up with the rate of global technological change, a loss of identity and degradation of Māori for rural communities and agricultural sector operators, the risk that policy becomes misaligned with the sector, with the needs of the sector and how it operates, an inability to maintain public acceptance to access or to operate in key markets, and a failure to understand and meet changing consumer preferences in the market. As I said, these are at a sector level. When you as an individual organisation are thinking about the risks that you may face into, there is a need to consider whether these are the most appropriate for your business, but they do represent a really great starting point for considering climate risk and how it's going to impact and how it's going to impact your business. While, as I said, these are not exhaustive lists, they are a really good starting point, and are certainly the 11 risks that we then use to play out across the climate scenarios that we developed. As I mentioned before, we developed 3 climate scenarios. This is quite a nice diagram in understanding, I suppose, where each of them impacts from a transition and a physical risk perspective. I'll go into more detail on each of the scenarios in a minute. But in terms of developing 3, this reflects, as I said before, the requirements of that climate-related disclosure standard for organisations to have 3 climate scenarios that they're considering. So the 3 scenarios we landed on for the sector, and these all go out to 2050, are an orderly scenario, a disorderly scenario, and a hothouse scenario. In terms of orderly and disorderly, these both assume that we as a country get to net zero by 2050. The differences being that under orderly, it's a really smooth transition, whereas disorderly is a lot more lumpy and volatile. So firstly, when we look at orderly, it means that as a whole planet, we've managed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the IPCC is already saying that the likelihood of that has almost been shot through, and it's very, very unlikely. The reason that we have looked at a scenario that's still limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is because it's really, really important for us still to maintain a very ambitious focus on what we would like to achieve. As individual organisations, as individuals, as a country, and as a planet, it's becoming increasingly unlikely, if not impossible, for us to reach that global warming limit. But at the same time, exploring this scenario gave us some understanding of what would be necessary if we were going to try to achieve that. Under this scenario, it assumes that climate policies are introduced immediately and become gradually more stringent. When we say gradually, we say it with a very light touch, because it means that they would have to ramp up very, very quickly if we're going to meet 1.5 degrees. In terms of the implications on the sector, we are likely to see a much more diverse agriculture sector in the future. It would also require emissions from the sector to be halved by 2050 compared to 2020. In terms of the disorderly scenario, the key thing to note here in terms of the differences is that policy landscape is a lot more delayed in kicking in. And so the volatility or the lumpiness that happens under a disorderly scenario is due to the fact that we coast along for another decade or so, and then there's suddenly a much more challenging regulatory or policy landscape that we're facing into. And then our response as a sector, as organisations, is a lot more volatile. You'll notice there that it says that warming reaches the 2-degree threshold around 2050. The reason that we haven't been able to hold the 1.5-degree warming ceiling, despite getting to net zero by 2050, is because that warming's cumulative. So we've already overshot it if we don't act sooner. And so we are still seeing the implications of starting too late in terms of our response to climate change under a disorderly scenario, even though we've still reached net zero by 2050. As a result, for the sector, huge increase in operating and capital costs, the likelihood that there's more stranded assets, and there is likely to be a lot more exotic forestry as well, because we, much to Rod Carr's distaste, will be trying to plant ourselves out of a climate crisis. And then finally, the other scenario we have developed is the hothouse scenario, which is essentially a world where we do absolutely nothing. So we keep on keeping on with current ways of operating, ways of doing business, and ways of fueling our growth. Our fossil fuel use continues to rise. Warming is not continues unabated. So we would be looking by 2080 of temperatures around of increases in warming to a 3-degree level. In terms of the implications for the agriculture sector, huge costs for farmers and growers, competition for land, struggle for financing, a likelihood that food production would fall, until we start to see some of that innovation kicking in terms of indoor farming systems and the emergence of different types of proteins, but they would likely be delayed as well. So what does that mean when we start to look at some numbers and statistics? In terms of the temperature and population rise, you can see that gradually increasing as you move across the 3 scenarios. The population rise is due to an increased likelihood of climate change refugees. So there's absolutely an acknowledgement that in New Zealand, while we will certainly suffer from the implications of climate change, there are other parts of the world that are going to be absolutely devastated, and the likelihood of increased population movements around the world means that we are more than likely to see an increase in our population as people choose New Zealand over other places in the world to live, or where other places become completely unlivable. You can see that extreme heat and extreme rainfall days continue to rise, even under the orderly scenario. It's certainly getting worse under disorderly and hothouse. And then from a livestock perspective, you'll see that the numbers decrease. The reason being for that is that there is less focus as you move through disorderly and hothouse on those policies or that regulatory environment that would drive emissions reduction, and therefore there's less focus on reduction in livestock or herd levels. Where you are seeing levels decrease, it's just because markets start to change and because of the implications of rising temperatures on those livestock. And then finally, in the bottom line, what's probably interesting to a lot of people is the changes in the carbon price. Explaining that in a little bit more detail, the reason that we have such a low carbon price, which might seem quite appealing under the hothouse scenario, is simply because there isn't the regulatory environment that's driving a cost on carbon the way it would under orderly or disorderly. So what you see is that carbon's cheap because no one is focusing on doing anything in terms of reducing emissions. The differences between orderly and disorderly, and why you have a higher price under per tonne under disorderly, is simply because that volatile regulatory environment is kicking in much later. And so in order to course correct, you're seeing a much higher price than you would under an orderly scenario. Just looking now in terms of how this information might be useful to you and your organisation, and how you might take the sector level scenarios and make them useful. Or it's important to remember, I suppose, that as I mentioned at the outset and have commented on a couple of times, that these scenarios have been developed very much based on the recommendations of the XRB to develop sector level scenarios. The idea behind that being that a sector level scenario analysis, that sort of the information that's provided through developing these scenarios can help drive consistency and comparability in terms of the individual climate disclosures that organisations will start making in 2024. The idea is not that organisations can, within the sector, can pick up these scenarios and say, okay, this is my scenario in my disclosure. It's more that these scenarios can be used as a useful starting point for you to consider what's appropriate for the scenario analysis for your organisation. In terms of the sector level assessments, there is an expectation that if you use this as a baseline, you're then saying as an organisation, well, at a sector level, they said that these 5 physical risks, for example, are the most material, or the key risks we should consider. As an exercise, are these relevant to our business? Do we consider these risks as being the most critical for us to consider in terms of how we look at climate change and how it might affect our business? Similarly, when you look at the scenario analysis, there are many assumptions that have been made in building out those scenarios, including the time horizons that have been looked at, the consideration, the geographic considerations, and some of the specific elements of the scenarios that make sense at a sector level. What's required for organisations as they start to become more familiar with the sector level analysis is the relevance of those assumptions to their specific businesses. There will be some things invariably that an organisation needs to dive into in more detail that we might have touched at a very high or broad level as part of the sector level analysis, but is much more important because of where you operate as a business and what you do as a business. And so for each of the aspects of both the risk assessment itself and the development of the scenario analysis, it's up to each individual organisation to challenge and validate where the assumptions that have been used as part of this work are appropriate and relevant for the business and how you operate. Similarly, with the sector level adaptation roadmap, there will be some things that are relevant to you as an organisation, and others that are less relevant that may touch you because of the system level community that you operate within as a sector and the value chain that you touch. It's probably not appropriate to pick up everything in the adaptation roadmap, but recognise that as a sector level plan for adapting to climate change, it's important that every organisation plays its part for the outcomes of the sector as a whole. Finally, in terms of thinking about climate scenarios, and both this work and the work that you may do if you're required to disclose under the climate-related disclosures, it's worth bearing in mind that this is really, really useful and critically important information for your business beyond that disclosure requirement. From an external perspective, yes, it's a requirement under the disclosure, but it also is becoming increasingly useful for conversations with investors and a broader stakeholder group, helping them understand how you've adequately considered a future for your business in light of a volatile and changing climate. As investors and broader stakeholders become more sophisticated in their ability to interpret climate scenarios, there is going to be more scrutiny around you as a business and how you might be using climate scenarios to inform your strategic decision making. In terms of developing the climate scenario narratives that support your decision making, these are a really, really useful communications tool with others outside of your organisation as well. From an internal perspective, in terms of testing business resilience in the future, these are absolutely a very critical and useful tool for every business. As I've said before, they are vital in informing strategic decision making in terms of informing capital investment in the future and managing risks and opportunities that you may face as a business. They also start to inform as well as the strategy and business model changes, the operating model changes that may be necessary to ensure your adaptation to climate change in the future, but also that business resilience piece for every organisation. So that's it. I appreciate there was a lot of information condensed into the last 30 or so minutes. Open to any questions any of you might have on the call, and we'll do my best to answer them. Have any. I hope that's because it all made sense. Jack, this might be a good time for you to talk about access to the climate scenarios in the process, both for the adaptation roadmap and the climate scenarios to be released more broadly, if there are no questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Annabelle, and just encourage anyone that might have questions that are percolating over the next few minutes to pop them in the chat or pop your hand up. Oh, I can see Matt's got his hand up, so let's go to Matt first before I kick into it. Annabelle.
Kia ora, Annabelle. Thanks for that. It's really excellent work and really useful. The question I had was around the conclusions on the, for example, herd number reductions in each of the scenarios. And I think I heard you correctly at the start say that the work has not considered mitigation because there's lots of other good work being done on that. Should I read the herd reduction numbers therefore as if mitigation can reduce emissions per animal through feed or other mechanisms, then that can be netted against the herd reduction conclusions that you've got in the work? Or have you taken that work into account and said, no, herds need to reduce by this size?
Yeah, okay. Good question. And the answer is probably not as straightforward as you'd like it to be. So when we, so the information on the livestock numbers and the herd count come from the Climate Change Commission scenarios. So I should have probably said as context, all of the data and the inputs into development of the scenarios have come from a wide range of sources, including the Climate Change Commission data sets. They're all listed in the back of the scenario analysis. It's not a case of us not looking at mitigation, and that's what creates the reduction in herd numbers, and you can't really net them off in the same way. What it's saying is, if as a whole, forgetting both mitigation and adaptation, and we look at, say, the disorderly scenario as an example, if in the future we as a country and the planet more broadly has done nothing to reduce emissions, therefore temperatures are going to continue to rise. And so for the agriculture sector, given we face into a reality where a large number of the greenhouse gas emissions come from methane, what the assumption we are making is that in a disorderly scenario, what is happening is that there's no focus on methane reduction and other greenhouse gas reduction. As a result, temperatures have continued to rise, and therefore, because there's been no focus on the methane reduction, there is likely to be less focus on reducing herd numbers. And again, the assumptions being made around that is that under the other two scenarios, if we've been able to reduce emissions globally, there is an assumption that in New Zealand, if New Zealand's playing its part, that one, we are using technology like methane inhibitors to reduce emission in the livestock we do have, but that we've also taken the action as a country to reduce absolute livestock numbers to bring down those methane emissions as well. So yeah, if I can explain more generally, when we look at the scenarios, there is not just one factor or one thing that's changing. It's a number of different elements that are contributing to get to what we see as a possible outcome in the future, which is that herd count or number.
I can see we've also got Nicola Shadbolt's hand up, Annabelle. Nicola, did you want to ask a quick question? And that will probably be our final one for the session. Nicola, I heard the first little bit, but we couldn't capture it after that. Through a bit quiet.
I'm changing the microphone to try and get one that works.
Excellent. I can hear you now.
I think that one works.
Yep.
Oh gosh, where to start? Thank you for the presentation. Having sat for 3 years on the Climate Change Commission, and so I'm very familiar with all the background to this. One of the issues with the IPCC scenarios is that they're not scenarios as those of us in the business world understand, where we look at possible plausible futures that could be anything. For these scenarios, they're based on a net zero. There is a common target, if you like, that we're all going to be aiming for, and then it's how messily or orderly we get into what brings blended. So I get all of that. What I see is missing in this, and it's mentioned in one of the scenarios that there could be a reduction in food production. The food production reduction out of New Zealand in both of those other two scenarios, I would say, would be significant, and yet there's nothing mentioned about food production. I'm just wondering how you link these to what will therefore come from the land. So that's one question. The other one is that I think it's really difficult to suggest that anything we do will influence, get a major part. I know everyone plays their part, but in terms of the global climate, which is what we are going to have to adapt to, that it's what's happening all around the world. And I think Annabelle would say that. What are the global policies? What are people doing globally? And that will impact whether we do or don't get 1.52 or whatever else we end up doing. And so our response is very much adaptation to your earlier point. And so I was really interested in your orderly, where somehow we were going to go to 34% horticulture on the basis of the world given it staying within the 1.5. But even that, look at what happened in Hawke's Bay recently. You know, I think many people who might have been putting another few $1 million into hectares for horticulture will be just wondering about that. So there's certainty that is there in horticulture. I find it a little bit interesting given the volatility before we even got to 1.5 is already quite high. So yeah.
Thanks, Nicola. I think I caught most of that. Forgive me if I don't cover everything off. In terms of your first question, this is a very, very high level summary of a 100-page report. So we absolutely do cover food production. It's just what we've tried to do to condense it for the hour we had today, and in terms of talking about the highlights, we just haven't covered it. I'm sorry in this discussion today, but it is absolutely covered in the broader report itself. This in terms of your second comment, because this is focused on adaptation and looking at climate scenarios, it's not in of itself suggesting in any way, shape or form that New Zealand, given our size and our population, can influence climate change at all. It's talking, when we talk about this, and as we outline in the analysis as well, we do take a global lens first in terms of what's happening globally and how that informs and influences the position that New Zealand itself ends up being in. And so it's not saying that we are the masters of our own destiny, unfortunately, in what might happen with the climate. It's more saying, because of these changes, how might the sector adapt, and what are the possible ways in which that might show up, based on these different scenarios that we play out. And so it's very much focused on adaptation, and we are at the mercy in some respects, unfortunately, of how others in much bigger markets play their part. And that is both in terms of reducing emissions, for one, but also in terms of how markets might change as well, whether it's from a regulatory perspective or the way consumer preferences and sentiment might change, and the access to technologies as well that could make our lives easier.
Can I just add something else? So, Annabelle, I agree that I understood that you were looking at the global aspect of it, but the response, the adaptation response, sounded like it was based on emission reduction. So if you're really looking at adaptation in terms of what enterprises manage the sort of onslaughts that the climate throw at us, it's quite a different conversation to whether some emit more than others. So, for example, you just sort of think of the heavy rain event, animals will hunker up in a corner, say this isn't much fun, but an hour later we'll be slipping around and feeling okay, a crop will be totally different. So adaptation is actually how do we cope with these onslaughts. And to be honest, I don't think anywhere is there an automatic assumption that we will be reducing livestock numbers. There's definitely something where we will reduce emissions through technology, but I think to take the livestock numbers out and say we have all of the horticulture as an adaptation response sounds quite incredible to me, having just absorbed the last onslaught of climate. Then I'll stop now. This is very good. But thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nicola. I only caught some of the end of that, but yeah, this is not an adaptation response. It was purely going through the scenarios, but certainly hear what you're saying.
Given us a nice lead in, Nicola, to the adaptation response. So I know we're over time. Thank you for those of you who are still with us. I'm just going to take 2 minutes to quickly talk about the launch of the Adaptation Roadmap and what's happening next, and then I'll pass to Jenny to close our session. So firstly, a big thank you to you, Annabelle, for taking us through, and for those of you who have put through comments and questions for the session. So those who I haven't met yet, I'm the Director of Implementation at the Aotearoa Circle with a focus on the Manakai and Agri-Adaptation work streams. And Agri-Adaptation Roadmap is our follow-up piece of work, which has also been co-developed alongside the climate scenarios in collaboration with PwC, our leadership group, our technical expert group, the key government agencies, and us here at the Aotearoa Circle. So we're in the final stages of finalising that roadmap over the next 6 weeks, and it will be launched in a webinar on the 7th of June. There's going to be an opportunity for advanced registration for the event, which is going to be emailed to you all with the climate scenarios report immediately after this call. And then we'll also be conducting an interactive workshop at the upcoming E Tipu iWhama World Conference in mid-June. We'll be welcoming engagement from across the sector. So if you've got any feedback or you want to have final input on the roadmap and haven't yet had the opportunity, you'll be welcome to contact me, and my details will be in the follow-up email. But for now, just to thank you for joining the session on behalf of the Aotearoa Circle, and we'll look forward to your continued engagement. And I'll pass along to Jenny to close us for the session.
Kia ora. Thank you, and thank you, Annabelle, and thank you those of you for the questions. I think it really highlights the fact that these scenarios are there to designed to engender the discussion, and the discussion is the most important part. So identify what you agree with, what you don't. There'll be lots of those conversations that come, but the main thing is the what if, and then how might we plan and prepare around that as well. Because one thing's guaranteed with scenarios, that it won't all come true, and we don't know what's going to happen, but it's that preparing for the what if, and from where to be able to take the scenarios and have that discussion around the management tables, the board tables, and your community groups, because that information is now out there. There's NIWA data, there's lots of data that people can be drawing on. And then what we want to be able to do is, how do we make it more accessible, more be able to be utilised more, to be able to inform those discussions and those planning decisions for businesses and communities. So thank you all for your time again today, and I'll close with a karakia. Kua tipu ngā rākau, kua puai ngā hua, kua waiata ngā manu, kua tau te wao, kua tau, kua taue, haere mai te aohatanga, humie, huie, tai kie.